The Professor, by Charlotte Brontë. Chapter 2. A fine October morning succeeded to the foggy evening that had witnessed my first introduction to Crimsworth Hall. I was early up and walking in the large park-like meadows surrounding the house. The autumn sun, rising over the Shire hills, disclosed a pleasant country. Woods, brown and mellow, varied the fields from which the harvest had been lately carried. A river, gliding between the woods, caught on its surface the somewhat cold gleam of the October sun and sky. At frequent intervals along the banks of the river, tall cylindrical chimneys, almost like slender round towers, indicated the factories which the trees half concealed. Here and there, mansions, similar to Crimsworth Hall, occupied agreeable sites on the hillside. The country wore, on the whole, a cheerful, active, fertile look. Steam, trade, machinery had long banished from it all romance and seclusion. At a distance of 5 miles, a valley opening between the low hills held in its cups another great town. A dense, permanent vapour brooded over this locality. There lay Edward's concern. I forced my eye to scrutinize this prospect. I forced my mind to dwell on it for a time, and when I found that it communicated no pleasurable emotion to my heart, that it stirred in me none of the hopes a man ought to feel when he sees laid before him the scene of his life's career, I said to myself, "William, you are a rebel against circumstances. You are a fool, and know not what you want. You have chosen trade, and you shall be a tradesman. Look," I continued mentally, "look at the sooty smoke in that hollow, and know that there is your post. There you cannot dream, you cannot speculate and theorize. There you shall out and work." Thus, self-schooled, I returned to the house. My brother was in the breakfast-room. I met him collectedly. I could not meet him cheerfully. He was standing on the rug, his back to the fire. How much did I read in the expression of his eye as my glance encountered his when I advanced to bid him good morning? How much that was contradictory to my nature. He said good morning abruptly and nodded, and then he snatched, rather than took, a newspaper from the table and began to read it with the air of a master who seizes a pretext to escape the bore of conversing with an underling. It was well I had taken a resolution to endure for a time, or his manner would have gone far to render insupportable the disgust I had just been endeavouring to subdue. I looked at him. I measured his robust frame and powerful proportions. I saw my own reflection in the mirror over the mantelpiece. I amused myself with comparing the two pictures. In face I resembled him, though I was not so handsome. My features were less regular. I had a darker eye and a broader brow. In form I was greatly inferior, thinner, slighter, not so tall. As an animal, Edward excelled me far. Should he prove as paramount in mind as in person, I must be a slave, for I must expect from him no lion-like generosity to one weaker than himself. His cold avaricious eye, his stern forbidding manner, told me he would not spare. Had I then force of mind to cope with him? I did not know. I had never been tried. Mrs. Crimsworth's entrance diverted my thoughts for a moment. She looked well, dressed in white, her face and her attire shining in morning and bridal freshness. I addressed her with the degree of ease her last night's careless gaiety seemed to warrant, but she replied with coolness and restraint. Her husband had tutored her. She was not to be too familiar with his clerk. As soon as breakfast was over, Mrs. Crimsworth intimated to me that they were bringing the gig round to the door, and that in 5 minutes he should expect me to be ready to go down with him. I did not keep him waiting. We were soon dashing at a rapid rate along the road. The horse he drove was the same vicious animal about which Mrs. Crimsworth had expressed her fears the night before. Once or twice Jack seemed disposed to turn restive, but a vigorous and determined application of the whip from the ruthless hand of the master soon compelled him to submission, and Edward's dilated nostril expressed his triumph in the result of the contest. He scarcely spoke to me during the whole of the brief drive, only opening his lips at intervals to damn his horse. The town was all stir and bustle when we entered it. We left the clean streets where there were dwelling-houses and shops, churches and public buildings. We left all these, and turned down to a region of mills and warehouses. Thence we passed through 2 massive gates into a great paved yard, and we were in Big Ben Close, and the mill was before us, vomiting soot from its long chimney, and quivering through its thick brick walls with the commotion of its iron bowels. Workpeople were passing to and fro. A wagon was being laden with pieces. Mr. Crimsworth looked from side to side, and seemed at one glance to comprehend all that was going on. He alighted, and leaving his horse and gig to the care of a man who hastened to take the reins from his hand, He bid me follow him to the counting-house. We entered it, a very different place from the parlours of Crimsworth Hall, a place for business, with a bare planked floor, a safe, 2 high desks and stools, and some chairs. A person was seated at one of the desks, who took off his square cap when Mr. Crimsworth entered, and in an instant was again absorbed in his occupation of writing or calculating, I know not which. Mr. Crimsworth, having removed his mackintosh, sat down by the fire. I remained standing near the hearth. He said presently, "Staton, you may leave the room. I have some business to transact with this gentleman. Come back when you hear the bell." The individual at the desk rose and departed, closing the door as he went out. Mr. Crimsworth stirred the fire, then folded his arms, and sat a moment thinking, his lips compressed, his brow knit. I had nothing to do but to watch him, how well his features were cut, what a handsome man he was. Whence, then, came that air of contraction, that narrow and hard aspect on his forehead in all his lineaments? Turning to me, he began abruptly, "You are come down to town to learn to be a tradesman?" "Yes, I am." "Have you made up your mind on the point? Let me know that at once." "Yes." "Well, I am not bound to help you, but I have a place here vacant if you are qualified for it. I will take you on trial. What can you do? Do you know anything besides that useless trash of college learning, Greek, Latin, and so forth?" "I have studied mathematics." "Stuff! I dare say you have. I can read and write French and German." "Hum." He reflected a moment, then, opening a drawer in a desk near him, took out a letter and gave it to me. "Can you read that?" he asked. It was a German commercial letter. I translated it. I could not tell whether he was gratified or not. His countenance remained fixed. "It is well," he said, after a pause, "that you are acquainted with something useful, something that may enable you to earn your board and lodging. Since you know French and German, I will take you as second clerk to manage the foreign correspondence of the house. I shall give you a good salary, £90 a year. And now," he continued, raising his voice, "hear once for all what I have to say about our relationship and all that sort of humbug. I must have no nonsense on that point. It would never suit me. I shall excuse you nothing on the plea of being my brother. If I find you stupid, negligent, dissipated, idle, or possessed of any faults detrimental to the interests of the house, I shall dismiss you as I would any other clerk. £90 a year are good wages, and I expect to have the full value of my money out of you. Remember, too, that things are on a practical footing in my establishment. Business-like habits, feelings, and ideas suit me best. Do you understand?" "Partly," I replied. "I suppose you mean that I am to do my work for my wages, not to expect favour from you, and not to depend on you for any help but what I earn. That suits me exactly, and on these terms I will consent to be your clerk." I turned on my heel and walked to the window. This time I did not consult his face to learn his opinion. What it was I do not know, nor did I then care. After a silence of some minutes he recommenced. "You perhaps expect to be accommodated with apartments at Crimsworth Hall, and to go and come with me in the gig. I wish you, however, to be aware that such an arrangement would be quite inconvenient to me. I like to have the seat in my gig at liberty for any gentleman for whom business reasons I may wish to take down to the hall for a night or so. You will seek out lodgings in town." Quitting the window, I walked back to the hearth. "Of course I shall seek out lodgings in town," I answered. "It would not suit me either to lodge at Crimsworth Hall." My tone was quiet. I always speak quietly. Yet Mr. Crimsworth's blue eye became incensed. He took his revenge rather oddly. Turning to me, he said bluntly, "You are poor enough, I suppose. How do you expect to live till your quarter salaries become due?" "I shall get on," said I. "How do you expect to live?" he repeated in a louder voice. "As I can, Mr. Crimsworth." "Get into debt at your peril. That's all," he answered. "For aught I know, you may have extravagant aristocratic habits. If you have, drop them. I tolerate nothing of the sort here, and I will never give you a shilling extra, whatever liabilities you may incur. Mind that." "Yes, Mr. Crimsworth. You will find I have a good memory." I said no more. I did not think the time was come for such parley. I had an instinctive feeling that it would be folly to let one's temper effervesce often with such a man as Edward. I said to myself, "I will place my cup under this continual dropping. It shall stand there still and steady. When full, it will run over of itself. Meantime, patience." Two things are certain. I am capable of performing the work Mr. Crimsworth has set me. I can earn my wages conscientiously, and those wages are sufficient to enable me to live. As to the fact of my brother assuming towards me the bearing of a proud, harsh master, the fault is his, not mine, and shall his injustice, his bad feeling, turn me at once aside from the path I have chosen? No. At least, ere I deviate, I will advance far enough to see whither my career tends. As yet, I am only pressing in at the entrance, a straight gate enough. It ought to have a good terminus. While I thus reasoned, Mr. Crimsworth rang a bell. His first clerk, the individual dismissed previously to our conference, re-entered. "Mr. Staton," said he, "show Mr. William the letters from Voss Brothers, and give him English copies of the answers. He will translate them." Mr. Staton, a man of about 35, with a face at once sly and heavy, hastened to execute this order. He laid the letters on his desk, and I was soon seated at it and engaged in rendering the English answers into German. A sentiment of keen pleasure accompanied this first effort to earn my own living, a sentiment neither poisoned nor weakened by the presence of the taskmaster, who stood and watched me for some time as I wrote. I thought he was trying to read my character, but I felt as secure against his scrutiny as if I had had on a casque with the visor down, or rather I showed him my countenance with the confidence that one would show an unlearned man a letter written in Greek. He might see lines and trace characters, but he could not make anything of them. My nature was not his nature, and its signs were to him like the words of an unknown tongue. Ere long he turned away abruptly, as if baffled, and left the counting-house. He returned to it but twice in the course of that day. Each time he mixed and swallowed a glass of brandy and water, the materials for making which he extracted from a cupboard on one side of the fireplace. Having glanced at my translations, he could read both French and German, he went out again in silence. The end of Chapter 2. Read by Rick Kistner, for Lit2Go on the web at fcit.usf.edu. The Professor, by Charlotte Brontë. Chapter 3. I served Edward as his second clerk faithfully, punctually, diligently. What was given me to do, I had the power and the determination to do well. Mr. Crimsworth watched sharply for defects, but found none. He set Timothy Staton, his favourite and head man, to watch also. Tim was baffled. I was exact as himself, and quicker. Mr. Crimsworth made inquiries as to how I lived, whether I got into debt. No. My accounts with my landlady were always straight. I had hired small lodgings, which I contrived to pay for out of a slender fund, the accumulated savings of my Eton pocket-money, whereas it had ever been abhorrent to my nature to ask pecuniary assistance. I had early acquired habits of self-denying economy, husbanding my monthly allowance with anxious care in order to obviate the danger of being forced in some moment of future exigency to beg additional aid. I remember many called me miser at the time, and I used to couple the reproach with this consolation: better to be misunderstood now than repulsed hereafter. At this day I had my reward. I had had it before, when on parting with my irritated uncles, one of them threw down on the table before me a £5 note, which I was able to leave there, saying that my travelling expenses were already provided for. Mr. Crimsworth employed Tim to find out whether my landlady had any complaint to make on the score of my morals. She answered that she believed I was a very religious man, and asked Tim in her turn if he thought I had any intention of going into the church some day, for, she said, she had had young curates to lodge in her house who were nothing equal to me for steadiness and quietness. Tim was a religious man himself. Indeed, he was a joined Methodist, which did not, be it understood, prevent him from being at the same time an engrained rascal, and he came away much posed at hearing this account of my piety. Having imparted it to Mr. Crimsworth, that gentleman, who himself frequented no place of worship and owned no god but Mammon, turned the information into a weapon of attack against the equitability of my temper. He commenced a series of covert sneers of which I did not at first perceive the drift, till my landlady happened to relate the conversation she had had with Mr. Staton. This then enlightened me. Afterwards I came to the counting-house prepared, and managed to receive the mill-owner's blasphemous sarcasms, when next levelled at me, on a buckler of impenetrable indifference. Ere long he tired of wasting his ammunition on a statue, but he did not throw away the shafts. He only kept them quiet in his quiver. Once during my clerkship I had an invitation to Crimsworth Hall. It was on the occasion of a large party given in honour of the master's birthday. He had always been accustomed to invite his clerks on similar anniversaries, and could not well pass me over. I was, however, kept strictly in the background. Mrs. Crimsworth, elegantly dressed in satin and lace, blooming in youth and health, vouchsafed me no more notice than was expressed by a distant move. Crimsworth, of course, never spoke to me. I was introduced to none of the band of young ladies who, enveloped in silvery clouds of white gauze and muslin, sat in array against me on the opposite side of a long and large room. In fact, I was fairly isolated, and could but contemplate the shining ones from afar, and when weary of such a dazzling scene, turned for a change to the consideration of the carpet pattern. Mr. Crimsworth, standing on the rug, his elbow supported by the marble mantelpiece, and about him a group of very pretty girls with whom he conversed gaily, Mr. Crimsworth, thus placed, glanced at me. I looked weary, solitary, kept down like some desolate tutor or governess. He was satisfied. Dancing began. I should have liked well enough to be introduced to some pleasing and intelligent girl, and to have freedom and opportunity to show that I could both feel and communicate the pleasure of social intercourse, that I was not, in short, a block or a piece of furniture, but an acting, thinking, sentient man. Many smiling faces and graceful figures glided past me, but the smiles were lavished on other eyes, the figures sustained by other hands than mine. I turned away, tantalized, left the dancers, and wandered into the oak-panelled dining-room. No fibre of sympathy united me to any living thing in this house. I looked for, and found my mother's picture. I took a wax taper from a stand and held it up. I gazed long, earnestly. My heart grew to the image. My mother, I perceived, had bequeathed to me much of her features and countenance, her forehead, her eyes, her complexion. No regular beauty pleases egotistical human beings so much as a softened and refined likeness of themselves. For this reason, fathers regard with complacency the lineaments of their daughters' faces, where frequently their own similitude is found flatteringly associated with softness of hue and delicacy of outline. I was just wondering how that picture, to me so interesting, would strike an impartial spectator, when a voice close behind me pronounced the words, "Humph! There's some sense in that face." I turned. At my elbow stood a tall man, young, though probably 5 or 6 years older than I, in other respects of an appearance, the opposite to commonplace. Though just now, as I am not disposed to paint his portrait in detail, the reader must be content with the silhouette I have just thrown off. It was all I myself saw of him for the moment. I did not investigate the colour of his eyebrows, nor of his eyes either. I saw his stature, and the outline of his shape. I saw, too, his fastidious-looking retrousse nose. These observations, few in number and general in character, the last excepted, sufficed, for they enabled me to recognize him. "Good evening, Mr. Hunson," muttered I with a bow, and then, like a shy noodle as I was, I began moving away. And why? Simply because Mr. Hunson was a manufacturer and a mill-owner, and I was only a clerk, and my instinct propelled me from my superior? I had frequently seen Hunson in Bigben Close, where he came almost weekly to transact business with Mr. Crimsworth, but I had never spoken to him, nor he to me, and I owed him a sort of involuntary grudge, because he had more than once been the tacit witness of insults offered by Edward to me. I had the conviction that he could only regard me as a poor, spirited slave, wherefore I now went about to shun his presence and eschew his conversation. "Where are you going?" asked he, as I edged off sideways. I had already noticed that Mr. Hunson indulged in abrupt forms of speech, and I, perversely, said to myself, "He thinks he may speak as he likes to a poor clerk, but my mood is not perhaps so supple as he deems it, and his rough freedom pleases me not at all." I made some slight reply, rather indifferent than courteous, and continued to move away. He coolly planted himself in my path. "Stay here a while," said he. "It is so hot in the dancing-room. Besides, you don't dance. You have not had a partner tonight." He was right, and as he spoke, neither his look, tone, nor manner displeased me. My amour propre was propitiated. He had not addressed me out of condescension, but because, having repaired to the cool dining-room for refreshment, he now wanted someone to talk to by way of temporary amusement. I hate to be condescended to, but I like well enough to oblige. I stayed. "That is a good picture," he continued, recurring to the portrait. "Do you consider the face pretty?" I asked. "Pretty? No. How can it be pretty with sunk eyes and hollow cheeks? But it is peculiar. It seems to think. You could have a talk with that woman, if she were alive, on other subjects than dress, visiting, and compliments." I agreed with him, but did not say so. He went on. "Not that I admire a head of that sort. It wants character and force. There's too much of the sensitive," so he articulated it, curling his lip at the same time, "in that mouth. Besides, there is aristocrat written on the brow and defined in the figure. I hate your aristocrats." "You think, then, Mr. Hunson, that patrician descent may be read in a distinctive cast of form and features?" "Patrician descent be hanged! Who doubts that your lordlings may have their distinctive cast of form and features as much as we shire tradesmen have ours? But which is the best? Not theirs, assuredly. As to their women, it is a little different. They cultivate beauty from childhood upwards, and may, by care and training, attain to a certain degree of excellence in that point, just like the Oriental odalisques. Yet even this superiority is doubtful. Compare the figure in that frame with Mrs. Edward Crimsworth. Which is the finer animal?" I replied quietly, "Compare yourself and Mr. Edward Crimsworth, Mr. Hunson." "Oh, Crimsworth is better filled up than I am. I know, besides, he has a straight nose, arched eyebrows, and all that, but these advantages, if they are advantages, he did not inherit from his mother, the patrician, but from his father, old Crimsworth, who, my father says, was as veritable a shireman, blue dyer, as ever put indigo in a vat, yet withal the handsomest man in the 3 ridings. It is you, William, who are the aristocrat of your family, and you are not as fine a fellow as your plebeian brother by long chalk." There was something in Mr. Hunson's point-blank mode of speech which rather pleased me than otherwise, because it set me at my ease. I continued the conversation with a degree of interest. "How do you happen to know that I am Mr. Crimsworth's brother? I thought you and everybody else looked upon me only in the light of a poor clerk." "Well, and so we do. And what are you but a poor clerk? You do Crimsworth's work, and he gives you wages. Shabby wages they are, too." I was silent. Hunsden's language now bordered on the impertinent. Still, his manner did not offend me in the least. It only piqued my curiosity. I wanted him to go on, which he did in a little while. "This world is an absurd one," said he. "Why so, Mr. Hunsden?" "I wonder you should ask. You are yourself a strong proof of the absurdity I allude to." I was determined he should explain himself of his own accord without my pressing him so to do, so I resumed my silence. "Is it your intention to become a tradesman?" he inquired presently. "It was my serious intention 3 months ago." "Humph! The more fool you. You look like a tradesman. What a practical, business-like face you have." "My face is as the Lord made it, Mr. Hunsden." "The Lord never made either year, face, or head for town. What good can your bumps of ideality, comparison, self-esteem, conscientiousness do you here? But if you like Bigben Close, stay there. It's your own affair, not mine." "Perhaps I have no choice." "Well, I care naught about it. It will make little difference to me what you do or where you go. But I'm cool now. I want to dance again, and I see such a fine girl sitting in the corner of the sofa there by her mamma. See if I don't get her for a partner in a jiffy. There's Waddy, Sam Waddy, making up to her. Won't I cut him out?" And Mr. Hunson strode away. I watched him through the open folding doors. He outstripped Waddy, applied for the hand of the fine girl, and led her off triumphant. She was a tall, well-made, full-formed, dashingly dressed young woman, much in the style of Mrs. E. Crimsworth's. Hunsden whirled her through the waltz with spirit. He kept at her side during the remainder of the evening, and I read in her animated and gratified countenance that he succeeded in making himself perfectly agreeable. The mamma, too, a stout person in a turban, Mrs. Lupton by name, looked well pleased. Prophetic visions probably flattered her inward eye. The Hunsdens were of an old stem, and, scornful as York, such was my late interlocutor's name, professed to be of the advantages of birth. In his secret heart he well knew and fully appreciated the distinction his ancient, if not high lineage, conferred on him in a mushroom place like this shire. concerning whose inhabitants it was proverbially said that not 1 in 1,000 knew his own grandfather. Moreover, the Hunsdons, once rich, were still independent, and report affirmed that York bade fair, by his success in business, to restore to pristine prosperity the partially decayed fortunes of his house. These circumstances considered, Mrs. Lupton's broad face might well wear a smile of complacency as she contemplated the heir of Hunsdon Wood occupied in paying assiduous court to her darling Sarah Martha. I, however, whose observations, being less anxious, were likely to be more accurate, soon saw that the grounds for maternal self-congratulation were slight indeed. The gentleman appeared to me much more desirous of making than susceptible of receiving an impression. I know not what it was in Mr. Hunsdon that, as I watched him, I had nothing better to do, suggested to me, every now and then, the idea of a foreigner. In form and features he might be pronounced English, though even there one caught a dash of something Gallic. But he had no English shyness. He had learnt somewhere, somehow, the art of setting himself quite at his ease, and of allowing no insular timidity to intervene as a barrier between him and his convenience or pleasure. Refinement he did not affect, yet vulgar he could not be called. He was not odd, no quiz, yet he resembled no one else as I had ever seen before. His general bearing intimated complete, sovereign satisfaction with himself, yet at times an indescribable shade passed like an eclipse over his countenance, and seemed to me like the sign of a sudden and strong inward doubt of himself, his words and actions, an energetic discontent at his life or his social position, his future prospects or his mental attainments, I know not which. Perhaps, after all, it might only be a bilious caprice. The end of Chapter 3. Read by Rick Kistner for Lit2Go on the web at fcit.usf.edu.